Have there been moments when you've brought questions to Jesus that you still don't have answers for?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Is there more to that question, or is it?
No.
Okay.
How has that affected your quest toward intimacy?
I think that it is safe to say it's why it became a series.
Yeah.
When you begin to realize that some of those things are not going to sort out. Yeah. Okay, like for instance, when in our relationship with him, he's answering all these other things. Does this ever happen with you? Mm-hmm. Besides the one thing you keep asking over and over.
Oh, yes.
Then you begin to kind of get a clue that he's going, I'm perfectly capable of answering that.
Right.
But there's a reason why I'm leaving that in the unfathomable right now for you. There is a reason why that is off limits for you, and I'm bringing all these other things. This is what is helpful to me. It's one reason why I take part in this dialogue, in this inquiry with Jesus, that I ask him, that even as I'm studying, I ask him lots of questions, and he's never one time answered me out loud, but like even if something seems odd to me, and like, Lord, how does that work? I'm going to say that out loud right then in my study time, because I want him to talk to me. I want to talk back. Mm-hmm. But what happens for me is that there are so many answers that he does give us. Yeah. So many things he does shed light on. And sometimes he does it through an event or experience. Like I'll have asked him about, Lord, what is up with that situation? Yeah. And then soon I'll see. Mm-hmm. And other times he'll do it through almost a parable, like he does so often in the Word. They would ask him a question and he'd tell them a story. Well, I'll see something lived out in front of me and think, oh Lord, that is so interesting. Yeah. That's so interesting. But so many answers do come, and I keep asking the questions, and somehow I know. I shared with the opening group that if I know enough statements that end in definitive periods, my God is good, period. My God is faithful, period. My God will always come through, period. He will always work it all together for good, period. Then I can still live with those dangling question marks that just drive me crazy. Yeah. Just drive me crazy.
Yeah. Do you feel like when you've asked those questions that he does eventually answer, it's helpful for you to just kind of hang on to those questions and be looking for the answer?
Yes.
Okay.
I always consider, in the old days of phones that had cords.
Yes.
This is the unfortunate part about not having it anymore, because this saying does not make sense when you push hold on something and it blinks.
Yes, yes.
To me, all my questions I think of, maybe it just gives me comfort before the Lord, but all my questions in my mind are all blinking. The ones that aren't answered are all blinking, because one day, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we are going to know as we've been known. I've asked the Lord before, so are we going to know all at once? Because in some ways, because I am a student, I don't want to give up the search.
Right.
I love that. So, Lord, I mean, all at once? Are we going to know it all at once? Or is there this gorgeous, gorgeous, continual unfolding? He alone knows. But, Lord, I'm dying to show you something, because maybe it's just the way he does it sometimes, but I want you to notice, just to give you an idea, if you want to know something of what the quest is about, this I'm not using in the written material or in the session, so it's a perfect opportunity to tell it to you. Okay. Case in point, Acts chapter 9. Saul at this point, of course, is a murderous persecutor. He literally has watched the stoning of Stephen and has been happy about it. I read it again here lately, and it stunned me afresh. I don't know of anyone, I don't care how much they were my enemy, that I could ever bear to watch stoned and be able to say later, you know, that it was, yes. So this is the guy we've got here. So we have Saul in Acts chapter 9, and of course he's on the Damascus road. This is how his relationship with Jesus begins. It says in verse 3 of Acts 9, now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, begins with a question, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Listen to this, listen to this. And he says back to him, who are you, Lord?
Yeah.
Perfection. Their whole relationship started with questions.
Yeah.
He literally, Jesus introduced himself to Paul through, why are you persecuting me? Paul responds to him at that point, Saul, who are you? And so isn't that it? And in some ways, don't we spend our lives going, who are you, Lord?
Yeah.
And I mean that with wonder.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about that time in the Gospel of Mark where he gets up and he rebukes the winds and the waves, and they say, I mean, they've already seen him do all these things, and they say, who is this? That the winds and the waves obey him. Who? Who are you?
Yeah.
And I think, Lauren, if I could sum up the quest, this series, when all is said and done, here is what I'd say. Ultimately, every what and where and why and when and how will be summed up in one glorious, wonderful who.
In poring over all the questions that I could find in the scriptures, and at this point you know they are in the thousands, I came upon one that jumped out of a scene that had long since been so important to me. Luke chapter 7 has this scene where a woman comes in and anoints the feet of Jesus. Now, I've read it literally 100 times or more in the course of my life because I've been raised in church and because this scene became so important to me personally. One little portion of it is literally painted on my wall over my desk so that I can see it over and over. But this time around, with the quest in mind and looking for questions to pop off the page, especially divine questions, one came out of this scene that was stunning to me. I want to read it to you. Luke 7, starting with verse 36. One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is, and who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, say it, teacher. A certain moneylender had 2 debtors, one owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you have judged rightly. Then, verse 44, listen to this carefully. Turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, so please get this scene with me, because he's talking to Simon, but he's turning straight toward the woman who is known to be a sinner, the woman who has come in where he is reclining at table at the Pharisee's dinner and has washed his feet with this ointment and wiped them with her hair. He looks at her and says back to Simon, Simon, do you see this woman? I want to read the rest of it, and then I want you to come back with me to the question. I entered your house, but you gave me no water for my feet. But she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much. And he was forgiven little, loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. I want to revisit that one question that Jesus asked. Do you see this woman? I wonder if that falls upon your heart like it falls upon mine. Just to be really seen. That Jesus took personally that the Pharisees somehow had not seen her as the woman made in the image of God that she was, but that he had looked straight through her with his judgment and made her as nothing. And Jesus says, do you see this woman? The El Roi, the God who sees, made flesh and dwelling among them right there in the Pharisees' house. Do you really see this woman? There is something about knowing that we're seen. That we're seen. I don't know if you've been in a situation, or maybe you felt like you've lived through it for years in a particular environment where you felt like you were invisible. Does anyone see me? Does anyone know that I'm hurting? Does anyone know what I'm going through? Does anyone see my contribution? Does anyone even know I'm here? There is something about it, something about God making sure you know that he sees you, that can get you through. Just a little glimpse. He can do the smallest thing, just unique to you, something so individual, and somehow you know in your heart, the God who sees me. I love that the implication in the chapter is that Jesus took personally that Simon did not really see the woman. He looks straight at this woman and says back to Simon, do you see her? Jesus would have it that people would see us in the image of God like we are, that we would see one another. He holds us responsible, if I may be so bold, for the way we see one another. Jesus wanted that Pharisee to see that woman through his own eyes, because Jesus sees. I got to tell you something that really moved my heart a few days ago. I was driving through a parking lot not far from my office through a lot of businesses, and a carload of people got out of a particular SUV, and I could tell that they must be co-workers because they very obviously were dressed alike. All the men were in suits. There were 4 men and there was 1 woman, and she was also in a suit, a skirt and a suit jacket, very professionally dressed. I don't doubt that every single one of them were in corporate positions, probably big money makers. And I watched them for a moment because I had to stop for several people to cross. And, you know, my eyes are just drawn to all sorts of different women because that is my whole ministry. And I care about how women view themselves and how they seem to take in their environment and whether or not they are worthy of value and love. And so I was just taking in the scene, and I watched something that just was unavoidable to me, just woman to woman. I watched these 5 people get out of the car, 4 of them men, 1 of them was a woman. She was beautiful. She was meticulous. She had everything from head to toe. All 4 of those men were completely oblivious from the outward appearance to what they looked like and whether or not people were perceiving them the way they wanted them to. But the woman, she was reading herself constantly. I watched her look down to see if everything was right. I watched her reach up and work with her hair, and I could tell that she was touching her lipstick to make sure it was just right. I could tell that she was looking around her to see if anybody was watching. I could tell as she glanced down and searched her clothes, does everything look just exactly right? And meanwhile, not one of the men was doing that. Now, I'm going to tell you something. In a different environment, maybe it would have been 4 men that were all looking through their clothes to see if everything was creased just right, if everything. But in this situation, to me, it so spoke of what I often see, which is that a woman feels like she's got to look just right in order to be acceptable. That self-awareness that just drives us crazy. You and I are on a quest. And the most important part of our spiritual quest The part that's going to get us through is that we want to be God aware. But the thing about self-awareness is that the more we're self-aware, even if our self-awareness is to be critical of ourselves, or even not to like ourselves, or just to be somehow so turned inward, whether it's in vanity, in pride, or in self-loathing. But the whole thing about being so self-aware that we miss our God awareness, I want to call you out of some of that self-awareness. I want God to call me out of some of it. I want to do my best. I want to present my best self into a situation, but this self-awareness is just killing us. And I want to say something to you, woman to woman. We live in a culture that is feeding our self-awareness, that is feeding all of our insecurities. And we've got a decision to make. Is this the way we're going to do this thing? You know what I wanted to do? I wanted to roll down that window and say, you are a magnificent woman. You stand with your shoulders back, and you stand tall with your chin up, because you also have something to offer that workplace. You are a fabulous woman. You have been created in the image of God. You get to stand up straight and take this thing in like the woman that God has made you to be. But I couldn't quite do that, but I can do it here. There's this wonderful verse, perhaps you're familiar with it, out of Proverbs 31 verse 10, that says words that we're familiar with, many of us, in most of our translations. It says in some translations, a noble woman who can find. It says in my ESV, an excellent wife who can find. She is far more precious than jewels. But the word that is translated there in the Hebrew into wife could also just mean woman. It could be any woman in this context. The context chooses whether it's a woman who is married or not. In this context, she is. So it's been translated wife. But the woman there, that word could be anyone, single, married, widowed, divorced, separated. It's just a woman, an excellent woman. The way one translator translated the Hebrew in Word Biblical Commentary was this way: a woman of valor who can find, her value is beyond rubies. A woman of valor, that's what it's going to take. You and I, we're women, but we are women warriors on a quest, called to courage, called away from our self-awareness that just draws us out of our God awareness. Let's allow God to give us the bravery we need. Our little sisters, the little girls coming up behind us, they're looking to us to figure out what it's like to be a woman. Let them see women of valor in us. Let us be able to get out of a car surrounded by a whole lot of other people and not have to look up and down and wonder if we're okay. You know what? We are okay because we belong to Jesus. And if anyone looks at us wrongly, you know what we get to know that Jesus could say to them? Do you see this woman? Do you see this woman the way I see this woman? Because I will hold you responsible for not seeing her in the value that she brings. So I ask you the question, who can find a woman of valor? In Jesus' name, girl, you can. Right in your mirror. We're going to be on this quest anyway. Let's do it as a mighty and valiant warriors.